All right, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. This is What's New in Adaptive Physical Education. Your host, Scott McNamara, and I hope everyone's doing really well. We have a little bit of a different type of podcast going on today. We're not really talking about APE or APA very much, but in a sense we are. We're talking about ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, which was introduced in 1990, and I have Jeff Lee, a former guest who's with the nonprofit Adaptive Sports and Recreation in San Diego in California, and he was on the nonprofits one. He's executive director. And, we were going to do like a history portion of the show, and, it ended up being like a 20-some minute conversation, so we thought we would just give it to you, and, you can see it as a bonus episode or just a regular episode, and we got a lot more coming up, so I hope you enjoy. We just kind of talk about some of the facts about ADA, where it came from, and then Jeff is a chair user, and he kind of gives his own unique experience being from that perspective and what the law ADA meant to him and from his eyes. So I hope you enjoy it, and keep listening. Thanks. Jeff, you're going to be the new addition to my show. I'm really excited to have you on. I really am. ADA came out in 1990.
Yeah.
And from your perspective, being, somebody that does have a disability, when did you start noticing, when did you start noticing ADA? Do you think it just took a long time for the act to actually manifest?
Well, I noticed it a little bit at first, like everybody else did, right? There was more parking spaces and things of that nature seemed to pop up. I know there was, when I've had my first child with a disability, like I said, I was still relatively able-bodied. It was in that sort of period of time where I hadn't broken any legs for a long time, and so I was in pretty good shape. But when you have a child with a disability, you very suddenly become more aware of what's going on. You realize that there are buildings out there that don't have elevators, that you're just like, wait, what happened? But you start appreciating the things, especially living in Southern California, where you have curb cutouts and the ability to get to places. And I just remember being in college, how challenging it was to get to certain classes and stuff. And now I suspect that's probably a lot easier than it was back then. So. But it was definitely once I had a child with a disability, in the 90s, I began to kind of notice some of the changes.
So you're reading a book, right, on ADA?
Yeah, it's a really interesting book. I actually finished it, and I need to go back and read it again. It's to let everything kind of sink in. But it was really interesting because the book, and I'll plug the book because it is I think it's a good read for anybody who's interested in history and politics. It's called Enabling Acts, and it's a little bit of a look at the inside skinny of what was going on in Washington. There were some stories about Ted Kennedy having a shouting match with John Sununu in 1989 and whatnot. It's always fun to get a little bit of a reveal of what's going on in Washington. You have to be careful, though. You know what they say about watching sausages being made. You may not actually want to know what goes on in the back rooms in Washington, but it was a very interesting. It was an interesting book. It was interesting, and something that caught my eye was the people who were opposed to the ADA at some level and resisted it. And it wasn't always, I guess, sort of the usual suspects, if you will. In fact, it was actually kind of some surprising individuals or groups or organizations that were resisting the ADA. And it wasn't that they were resisting it because they felt that, people with disabilities were not deserving of some accommodation necessarily, but because their own interests would have been fairly negatively affected. So that was one of the things that was very surprising about the whole process as to who was really opposed to us as it was coming along.
Yeah, and I that's when I've even talked to some people. It sounds like the biggest issues were the
larger places that we're going to have to change, and the feasibility and price that goes with that change.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, educational institutions were generally speaking quite opposed to it across the board. I think universities were probably pretty bad. And there's a lot of discussion on how much money universities do and don't have at any given point in time. But some of those campuses have been, were built a very long time ago, and retrofitting them would be enormously expensive. So it's a little bit, it's easy to understand how complicated that would be. I guess the other one was the transportation companies. I would be curious to know, I should have looked it up, but how expensive it is to retrofit a bus, to make it wheelchair accessible, adding those lifts and some of the other mechanisms in, and do it in such a way that the bus is still usable by other people as well. So I wonder what the price tag of that turned out to be.
I'm sure, and sometimes you'll see with these disability or civil rights acts, sometimes the funding isn't always there for these massive changes.
Well, that was part of the game that was played. Of course, it's sort of like, we'll put I think even back to the Rehabilitation Act at some level, where it's sort of like we're going to require certain accessibility, but nobody's going to fund it, and we're going to give you the ADA, but the way we take the teeth out of the law is we eliminate any sort of funding, or maybe even I'm not sure what the situation with those tax breaks and stuff, but for these companies to have to go invest all this money, probably from their perspective, the question is, well, what's taking aside that's the right thing to do or not the right thing to do. I mean, what are we going to benefit from having done this? I'd like to think businesses are getting a little bit more cognizant of that it's to their benefit to allow access to more people, because you get more customers. That seems sort of business 101 right there. But
I want to touch on something I was just reading, and then maybe we could talk about the particulars that ADA does actually hit. And so, but I'm looking right now, and I see something I think that's pretty interesting. Have you heard of the Capitol Crawl before?
Yeah, that was one of the wasn't that one of the sort of protests, if you will, or demonstrations, I guess, that led to.
I think that was somewhere right before the actual act was passed. So I think that there was some traction on it, and I mean, so it looks like it was a disability right activist who had physical disabilities. And they're in front of the Capitol building in D.C., and who might have been in crutches, wheelchairs, power chairs, or some type of assistive device, they got out of those. And then they went on to actually crawl up all of the 100 steps that the Capitol building has, and they were yelling things like ADA now and vote now. And I think that there's some people that couldn't get up there, and they had signs that said things like ADA now and Capitol crawlers. Even a story about a young girl, Jennifer, who was a second grader with CP, and she was videotaped as she pulled herself up the steps using mostly arms and hands, and I guess she was saying the whole time, "I'll take all night if I have to." And that is a powerful, powerful image. What a message.
Yeah. I guess it was just referring back through the book. Yeah, I guess it was the legislation had bogged down in the House, and this was try to convince people to legislators to sort of get moving. Sometimes you have to embarrass them publicly in order to get action. I mean, and it's a statement right there that that here is a part of your constituency, and at a building that is all about representation of the public, and a chunk of the public can't get into the building. That's sort of that sign that something needs to be fixed.
All right. So Jeff, let's real quick. So what does the ADA Act do?
Well, I mean, it really sets standards. But it really sets standards for physical accessibility as well as, and I say physical in a broad sense, right? So it's not just about wheelchair ramps, but it's also about providing reasonable accommodations for individuals to utilize your your business or your, in particular, I believe it was public services, but businesses as well. And also, I believe it covered employment as well, didn't it? Accommodating people in the workplace. And and so it was really getting into the details of things that they attempted to take care of back in '73, I guess. Broadly speaking, with the Rehabilitation Act that had some very loose language about allowing equal access to people with disabilities to things like schools and whatnot. But that was always interpreted so narrowly that it was never very effective. I can tell you stories. I won't reveal cities necessarily or names of teachers. When I was in fourth grade, it was after the Rehabilitation Act had passed. I had a teacher who absolutely didn't want me in her classroom, and they just about agreed with her and pulled me out because she just didn't want a disabled kid in her classroom. And so the law was not written so strongly back then that it did a whole lot of good, to be honest. So, and the ADA attempted to fix a lot of that.
So, real quick, I got a book in front of me, The Inclusive Fitness Trainer, and it quickly goes over some of the ADA different titles or different categories. And just real quick, it was employment that it covers, state or local government entities, transportation, public accommodations, telecommunications, and then there's just miscellaneous provisions. And in that one, miscellaneous provisions could include fitness centers. And real quick, I wanted to talk about something that I'm familiar with is the AIM-Free manual. And I think it's underutilized instrument. And AIM-Free is accessibility instruments measuring fitness in recreational environments. And the instruments used to create barrier-free fitness environments for people with disabilities. And there's a whole bunch of different questionnaires and different scenarios and different sections on how to make a fitness center more accessible for people with disabilities, which is kind of interesting. And I don't know if you touched on this part too, but ADA also covers a little bit of mental disabilities as well, and trying to make things easy to use and understand, which is also an interesting portion of ADA.
Yeah, and we have the telecommunications access, which I don't think just making sure that was really that there was a mechanism for people who had some sort of hearing disability to be able to access phones. I know, for instance, if like I said, my brother-in-law who's deaf he's got a teletype machine, and he can actually run a phone call to somebody else where he gets an operator to assist. And I don't believe that was possible. I could be mistaken. I don't believe that was possible really pre-ADA. So he can fire up the teletype, get an operator, then that operator will translate, read off basically what's coming on to the T2A. Now I don't know to what degree it's used, it's quite as critical now, but certainly 20 years ago, back before instant messaging and chat and email and all that sort of stuff, before the ubiquity of those, that would be fairly critical. You wanted to contact somebody on the other side of the country, if they didn't have a teletype machine, there wasn't any option, homing pigeon or something. I guess just send mail.
So I looked up, you said when was that brought in? It was in 2008 actually. The ADA Amendments Act, it broadened the coverage of a disability from physical to mental, and they tried to say that it was any type of severely or any type of impairment that severely or significantly restricts one's a major aspect in their life. And so I think that tried to broaden that quite a bit. And interesting enough, that was brought in with George W. Bush Jr., and the ADA originally was a George W. Bush Sr. Act. And I mean, my history on presidents isn't all too good, but I'm pretty sure that first ADA Act in 1990 was one of the larger acts or one of the larger feats that George W. Bush Sr. kind of pushed through legislation-wise.
Yeah, I think that may effectively be the hallmark piece of legislation. That's one of those things that surprises everybody. Where you want to draw lines between one party and the other, and it's realistically this was it was very much a joint act. You had certain individuals who took positions. You had the sort of conservative desire to protect businesses, but you had somebody like Bob Dole in the middle of this mix as well, and he was you're not going to get him opposed to disability rights legislation for since he was wounded in combat so many years before that, and clearly, I mean, he tried to hide it, as a lot of people do, but there was a lot of support really across the board, but you did have a lot of the typical, business. Again, I appreciate it. I work in the private sector, and things can get really expensive, and if your profit margins are slim, I can imagine the sensitivity to being mandated to spend large sums of money. But it becomes tricky though as well, because then companies use that as sort of their own excuse for not moving forward. Yeah, one of the interesting things I want to throw out there, just I don't know if it happened anywhere else, but in Southern California, from sort of an interesting historical, and it's thankfully come to an end. I know in Southern California in order to enforce the law, if you will, the ADA, the method for doing so in most cases involves suing the company or the organization that you feel is not complying with the ADA. And so there was a little cottage industry created, at least for a while, with lawyers going out and trying to find businesses that they could sue. Not really in the interest of making things better, but rather to get money out of them in the process. So there's always a monetary component to it, and there was one lawyer roaming around Southern California notorious for doing that, and he finally got disbarred, if I remember correctly. So, but he did it for a long time. And it was unfortunate because we had I know of some organizations. There was a church I was a part of that had built a 2-story building sort of pre-ADA and didn't have an elevator, and they decided, well, especially I was there, my son was there, we should put an elevator in. And the city that we were in told the church, they said, oh, no, you don't want to pull permits for that. And they were sort of, well, why don't we want to pull permits? And the answer was, well, there's this lawyer who watches for that, and he will come and sue you for everything in your property that's not compliant to the ADA and get a lot of money out of you. And we didn't have enough money to fix everything.
Yeah.
So the end result was nothing got fixed. To avoid the lawsuit, nothing gets fixed. That's why. As I was, like I said, I was glad they finally reined him in and got rid of that. But
when I was reading about ADA as well, they talked specifically. One of the larger groups was some religious organization that was saying that certain churches did not have the money to, specifically churches did not have the money to follow the guidelines and make all the repairs that they were asking for, or removal of barriers that they were asking for.
Yeah. This, and the way the compromise finally, there was always a phase-in period. There's still buildings you can go to in Southern California that are still not accessible simply because they're grandfathered in. So there was a solution for that. If you're building a new church, you're building a new facility. It's not particularly expensive to make these accommodations, and if you're talking about retro, if you've got an existing one, then because I don't think, I'm not entirely clear that there was a significant and broad requirement for everybody to upgrade their facilities.
There was a grandfather clause.
Yeah.
And I mean, but ADA now is pretty specific too. Like, so a push door is not supposed to be any more than 5 pounds.
Yeah.
And your doors are supposed to be accessible. They're not supposed to have where you have to pinch down on something when you're pulling or opening anything, and you're supposed to have a certain amount of space for chair users, and buildings are supposed to have like a certain level of the front desk so that they can come up and talk to the front desk person rather than being really tall. So there, it's gotten to the point now, which is cool, that it's very specific rather than this broad, we're going to do this.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is, I think some of the opposition that came from different organizations was coming from the industry groups, not from the industry itself. And the reason I say that is when in the early '80s, I was asked by our mayor to work on a committee. This is again pre-ADA, with the idea of preparing a directory of businesses that were accessible to people. And so we had a committee of people with different disabilities, and the game was that we got publicized by the city. And also I'll mention the city because I think it was a very cool thing. It was the city of Thousand Oaks up north of LA. And we've said we'll put a directory together and we'll reach out to the businesses in the community, and if you want to be in the directory, let us know. And you're going to have this troop of disabled people land on your doorstep, and we're going to check it out. And if we think you're accessible, again, there's no standards. This is just sort of, we'll put you in the directory. And we had a lot of businesses reach out to us and say, yeah, we think we are and we want to be, so please come and let us know what we need to do better.
All right, everyone, that's the end of the episode, and I just want to once again say that Jeff and myself were not experts in Americans with Disabilities Act. We did use resources to help us with this podcast, several books and websites, and prior experiences as well, but we're not experts, and it's such a large law that we thought we would just, start that conversation. And if people online have any ideas or feedback that they want to give about the podcast, we'd love to get some of that. We have some other podcasts coming up. We're going to do one locally with a group of teachers, APE teachers, and we're really excited about that. So we'll talk to you real soon. Take care, and look at the resources on the blog as well, because I gave a lot with this one because we made a lot of references. So take care. Until next time. Bye.